Hansel and Gretel. A sarcastic fairy tale by Ron Mackenzie Lafergie. Narrated by Ron Mackenzie Lafergie. It's the same guy. Once upon a time, there was a poor woodcutter who lived in a cabin in the forest with his wife and 2 children. The boy was named Hansel, and the girl was named Gretel. So I guess they were in Germany or something. Actually, it would probably be pronounced Hansel, but there's no way I'll remember that, so let's stick with Hansel. Times were tough for the woodcutter. People just weren't buying his wood. Maybe the economy was bad, or the wood was too hard or too soft or something. I don't know, I'm not a woodcutter, so I don't know all the intricacies of cutting and selling wood. One night, the woodcutter was tossing and turning in his bed, unable to ignore his growing hunger, when he turned to his wife. "What are we going to do? My work provides barely enough to feed the 2 of us, let alone our children. What will we do?" He said all this in German, not English with a German accent, but I'm translating for your benefit. "Well," replied his wife, probably with a grin like the Grinch, because I cannot stress enough how much of a monster this bitch was. "How about we take them into the middle of the forest, give them each a piece of bread, and leave them there?" No, seriously, that was her idea. "What? No," said the woodcutter like a normal human being. "They'll never find their way out, and wild animals will tear them apart." "Well, then I guess we'll all just die," replied his wife, super passive-aggressively, before rolling over and going to sleep. This put the woodcutter in a bit of a pickle. On the one hand, he didn't want to send his children to their death, but on the other hand, his wife would be, totally annoying if he didn't, and she too would start refusing his wood. So, of course, he decided to just abandon his kids in the middle of the forest. But, he felt really bad about it. He frowned and everything. As it happens, the kids were awake as well, since they too were hungry, and they heard the whole thing. Because it was a small cabin, and the walls weren't exactly soundproof. A note for all you crazy fucks out there: if you're discussing plans to essentially murder your children who are in the next room, go ahead and check to make sure they're asleep first. When they heard the plan, the kids were, of course, a bit peeved. Gretel started crying, but Hansel, the older of the 2, put a hand over her mouth. Because he, unlike his parents, understood how sound works in a small, echoey cabin. "Shush, Gretel," he whispered. "If they hear you, we're done for. I'll figure something out, don't worry." Gretel calmed down, as she had the utmost trust in her big brother, who had never led her astray before. Slowly and quietly, Hansel snuck out of the house and into the front yard. There, he saw the white pebbles in front of the house, glowing in the moonlight, and inspiration struck. He shoved as many pebbles as he could into the pockets of his shabby pants and rushed back inside to his room. "Don't worry," whispered Hansel once he had returned to bed. "It'll be okay." Then they went to sleep. Well, they tried. They probably didn't sleep that well, seeing as their parents were going to abandon them the next day. The next morning, the woodcutter woke up his kids and said, "Hey, guys, so we are going out into the middle of the forest, because we are going to fetch some wood. Yeah." He didn't really sell it all that well, but he was a woodcutter, not an actor. The kids looked at each other meaningfully, then slowly rose out of bed to face their fate. If it was a movie, it'd be an intense moment with a rising crescendo of music. But this is a book, so you just need to take my word for it. They said goodbye to their bitch mother, who gave them a half-hearted kiss and sent them on their way. She would later claim that she was just trying to play it cool, but in reality she was just a sociopath. She gave them 1 piece of bread each and told them not to eat until dinner. Then they headed out. When they had traveled a short time, Hansel stopped and pointed back at the house. "Is that a chicken on the roof?" he asked. Of course, there was no chicken, but when his father turned to check, Hansel dropped a couple stones. To be honest, he probably didn't need to do the distraction because his dad was too busy trying not to give away his own plan, but it was a clever thought. As it was daytime, the stones didn't shine like they had the night before, but he knew they would glow like fireflies come nightfall. As long as it wasn't cloudy and the trees weren't in the way. But give him a break, he's a kid and didn't have much time to think it through. The woodcutter continued his ruse as they walked. He didn't get much better. Every few minutes he would say, "What a nice day. Everything's normal, don't worry. Just a normal day. Fetching wood." Seriously, if they hadn't heard the plan the night before, they'd still think something was up. At the same time, Hansel was only being slightly more subtle with his own ruse. As time went on, he started running out of things to point out, until eventually he had to resort to saying, "Look, a tree!" It wasn't his finest moment. But his dad was so distracted and so sad about losing his kids that he didn't even get annoyed. He soaked up all the joy he could from his kids. If you're starting to feel sorry for him, keep in mind he's about to abandon his children in the woods. After a few hours, they reached the middle of the forest. I mean, not actually the middle, but like a lot further in than the cabin was. The woodcutter turned to his kids and said, "Okay, guys, so let's build a fire. Everything's normal, we just need a fire. So go collect some sticks while I build it. Again, everything's fine." One meaningful look between siblings later, they went off to fetch some kindling and firewood, and soon the woodcutter had a raging fire going. He sat the kids next to it and said, Great, everything's normal. Now you two sit tight while I chop some wood. That's why we had to go to the middle of the forest, for wood. So I'll go chop some wood, and you two can just relax. Everything's fine." So the woodcutter went off to chop some wood. The kids sat in front of the fire, on edge, but the sounds of his axe chopping wood were soothing. As long as they heard those sounds, they knew they were safe. That is, unless the woodcutter had some elaborate scheme to trick them. Which, of course, he did. He attached a branch to an old tree, so when the wind blew it back and forth, it made it sound like an axe. I'll be honest, I'm picturing it, and I have no idea how this setup would sound remotely like an axe striking a tree, but that's what it says in the story, so that's what I'm telling you. If you can make sense of it, tweet me or something. Sadly, Hansel and Gretel didn't realize they were being fooled. And soon as the afternoon slump hit them and the warmth of the fire comforted them, they drifted off to sleep. Frankly, I'm not sure how they could fall asleep knowing they were going to be abandoned, but hey, kids sleep a lot. Plus, they'd had a lousy sleep the night before, so it makes sense, I guess. Sometime later, after sunset, the pair awoke and found that they were alone. They called out to their father, and again Gretel began to cry, but it was to no avail. They were alone, in the middle of the forest. Ish. But it was okay. Hansel took his sister's hand and told her not to cry. They would find their way home. They began searching the area and soon found their path of stones glowing in the moonlight. "Look, Gretel," cried Hansel softly. "The fairies will lead us home." Gretel could obviously tell they were just stones, but she appreciated that Hansel was trying to cheer her up. They walked all night long, and just as the morning sun began rising, they arrived back home. They knocked on the door, and their mom answered. She was, needless to say, pretty shocked, and very relieved to see her children safe and sound. Just kidding, she just gaslit the shit out of them. "You naughty children!" she exclaimed. "Sleeping all night in the forest while your father and I worked? And now you've made us worried sick." Hansel and Gretel apologized profusely, as kids raised by narcissists so often do, but it was to no avail. Their father, however, was actually relieved, because it really had been hard for him to abandon his kids like that, and this way he didn't have to contradict his wife. He embraced them, blinking through tears of joy. Some time passed, and the family was apparently able to survive, so I'm not sure what all the hubbub was about with the whole starving thing. However, a few months later, they found themselves in more dire straits, and Mother Dearest again turned to the woodcutter at night. "Well, we're out of food. Time to try abandoning the children in the forest again." You know, I'm starting to think the Brothers Grimm just hated women. "What?" replied the woodcutter. "It all worked out last time. Why would we—" "I said it's time to abandon them," she interjected. Then she started sulking again. And that was that. As Chandler Bing would say, whoopah! The kids heard this, of course, and again Gretel started to cry. And before you think she's a crybaby, keep in mind that she was like 6, and this was super traumatizing. You'd probably cry too. Again, however, Hansel comforted her and told her everything would be okay. Late at night, he snuck out of their room and crept to the front door. However, when he tried to leave the house, he was dismayed to find that his mother had locked the door. Although it was locked from the inside, so you'd think he could just unlock it, no? Maybe she took the key with her? Yeah, let's go with that. I don't know how she knew that locking the door at night would help, but maybe she was just worried about perverts or something. Hansel returned to their bedroom and told Gretel everything would be all right. He didn't tell her that he couldn't get the pebbles so she wouldn't worry, and just hoped that he could figure something out the next day. In the morning, the woodcutter woke the children, who again had barely slept. He popped his head into their room, an uncomfortable grin plastered on his face. Then he awkwardly breathed in through his teeth. "Hey, guys! Ready for a normal day in the woods where nobody gets abandoned?" He quickly ducked his head out of the room and cursed his inability to be cool, then popped his head back in and cleared his throat. "Ready for a regular day?" They weren't, but they said they were, and after a shitty goodbye from their terrible mother, who gave them each a small piece of bread, they headed out into the woods. Thinking quickly, Hansel crumpled his piece of bread in his pocket. As they walked, he would pause from time to time and secretly drop a crumb onto the ground. He didn't bother distracting his dad this time, as he realized it was kinda pointless. Again, they stopped deep in the forest, deeper than last time, and again their father built them a fire. This time they tried their hardest to stay awake, but their fatigue got the better of them, and they soon passed out to the sound of a branch hitting a tree, which, I'm sorry, would not sound anything like someone chopping a tree with an axe, but whatever, I'm dropping it. When they awoke, they found themselves alone yet again. Again, Gretel cried, and don't you dare judge her for it. And again, Hansel comforted her and told her he had a plan. He took her hand and began searching for his trail of breadcrumbs. However, it so happens that while they slept, a bunch of birds had eaten the bread Hansel dropped, so when they tried to find them, they could not. To be totally honest, even if the birds hadn't eaten the bread, it would be damn near impossible to find them in a forest anyway, especially at night. But sure, let's blame the birds. They searched for several hours before finally giving up and sitting down to rest. Now they were ravenous, and since they'd left the safety of the fire, they were cold and rather terrified. They found a few berries to eat, but found little else, and soon fell asleep. How they managed to sleep like that while surely being eaten alive by mosquitoes, I'll never know. Luckily, mosquitoes were the only wild animals to tear into their flesh that night, so they survived. And the next morning they set out again to try to find their way home. They searched and they searched, but if anything, they seemed to only travel deeper into the forest. In the late afternoon, they came upon a beautiful white bird which sang a happy melody from atop a tree stump. They watched it for a few minutes before it took off and flew away, with the kids making chase. I'm not sure if they were trying to listen to it or trying to eat it, but they were interested either way. They followed the bird until they came to a large clearing, in the middle of which stood a little house, which the bird landed on. As the pair approached, they saw that the house was made of gingerbread, and the windows were made of clear sugar. I mean, cards on the table, the story I'm reading just says it was made of bread and cakes, but as far as I'm concerned, it was a gingerbread house because that's what I always heard. Their bellies were rumbling with hunger, so they wasted no time tearing into the delicious house. They didn't stop to wonder how a house made of food wasn't rotten and soggy, they just ate of its delicious flesh. It was wonderful, and they found themselves in high spirits. After a few minutes, they heard an old woman's voice from inside the house. "Nibble, nibble, gnaw. Who is nibbling at my little house?" It was spoken like some sort of poem or song, but it didn't rhyme or anything. It was weird. Thinking quickly, Hansel replied, the wind, the heaven-born wind." He felt rather clever responding in the same style as she had asked her question. It didn't occur to him or Gretel that the wind can't talk, and he'd totally given themselves away. So they kept eating. A minute later, the front door opened, and they jumped. An old woman hobbled out, leaning heavily on a large walking stick. She gazed at the terrified children and smiled a toothy grin, though it would have been toothier had she more teeth.
"Oh dear, whatever are you doing alone in the middle of the forest? Come in, children, and I'll keep you safe and warm and fill your bellies."
Of course, being the learned fairy tale fans we are, we all know what she had in mind. But she had a much better poker face than the woodcutter, so the kids didn't suspect a thing, and happily trudged inside. She closed the door behind them and locked it, putting the key back in her pocket. Hansel and Gretel were sat down at the table and fed to their heart's content. They had big, fluffy pancakes with sugar, syrup, and jam, as well as all the sweets they wanted. Then the old woman led them to 2 small beds, and they laid down to sleep. They didn't stop to ponder why this old woman happened to have 2 small beds, or why they happened to be empty, or why there were chains attached to the beds. They were just happy to be full and comfy. They soon fell asleep, with content smiles on their faces. The next morning, they woke up, and the old woman said they would be having breakfast soon.
"But first," she crooned, "Hansel, could you please come with me into the yard? I need a big, strong boy's help."
Being the helpful kid he was, and feeling thankful for the food and lodging, Hansel wasted no time and followed the totally innocent old woman into the yard. She took him to the stable and opened the door. Then, when he looked inside, she shoved him in and locked the grated door. Then she cackled, because, get ready to have your mind blown, she was actually a witch who ate children. What? Hansel started crying, because boys cried too, especially me, but she didn't care and went back into the house.
"Where's Hansel?"
asked Gretel, worried.
"He's locked up in the stable,"
replied the witch, as her sugary voice became unpleasant and scratchy.
"And I'm going to eat him. But first, I'm going to fatten him up. And you will help me, or I'll eat you too."
Not to blow your mind twice in a short time, but Gretel started crying. Then the witch slapped her and told her to get to work or she'd have the child for dinner. So Gretel started cooking large meals to feed to her brother, while she was only allowed to eat, wait for it, crab shells. Not kidding, that's what it says. Doesn't sound all that possible, but what do I know? Time passed, and Gretel continued working for the witch, living off of crab shells somehow. She tried to come up with some way to save her brother, but could not figure it out, partly because it was a difficult situation, and partly because she was 6 and 6-year-olds are dumb. Oh, one thing I should have mentioned. Apparently witches have really bad eyesight. So to find out if Hansel was fat enough to eat, the witch would go to the stable every morning and tell him to stick out his finger so she could give it a feel. However, Hansel was a quick thinker, so whenever she asked, he would hold out a bone, making her think his finger was still bone thin and he was not ready to eat. This bafflingly worked for some weeks, but eventually the witch just couldn't wait anymore.
"Girl, get some water boiling," she said. "Tomorrow I will be eating your brother, whether he's fat or thin. Some boiling water, some carrots, potatoes, and a little boy, and baby, you've got a stew going."
Gretel thought it sounded more like a soup, but held her tongue, as the more important point was that her brother was about to be eaten by a wicked witch. And she cried. She cried as she fetched water from the well, she cried when she momentarily thought to run away and leave her brother, and she cried as she decided against it and brought the water back. Hansel heard her crying and tried to comfort her, but hearing his voice only made her cry harder. The next morning, the witch woke Gretel, who had hardly slept a wink, and told her to prepare the cauldron. As she did so, the witch began heating the oven. Then she turned to the girl.
"We will have bread with this stew," she said to Gretel. "Climb in and tell me if it's warm enough."
This struck Gretel as odd. First of all, she had no idea how warm was warm enough to bake bread, and second of all, she suspected climbing inside the oven was not the correct way to check. She realized that the witch planned to bake her in the oven. Thinking quickly, she asked, "How do I get in?"
"You just climb in,"
said the witch impatiently. It really wasn't that complicated.
Right, but how? Isn't it too small?
Like her brother, with his distractions, the thought was there, but the execution could use some work. Luckily, this wasn't a very smart witch, so it worked anyway.
Of course not. Even I can fit. Look, I'll show you,
she muttered, pushing the girl out of the way and climbing inside the oven. When she did so, Gretel slammed the door shut behind her, locking her in the oven like Joey in the entertainment unit on Friends. Oh, weird. 2 Friends references in one story. I might have a problem. However, while Joey was merely robbed, things went much worse for the witch. As the temperature rose, her screams of anger turned into wails of pain. The flames began licking her, and her clothes caught fire. Then her screaming got louder and louder, before stopping. She was dead. See? Gretel's not so useless anymore. Girl power! Yas, queen! Side note, this grisly murder would go on to scar the hell out of Gretel, but that's another story. Gretel rushed outside to Hansel, who was elated to hear that he was saved. However, without the key, Gretel couldn't open the door. So she went inside and turned off the oven so it could cool. Once the oven cooled, Gretel had the unfortunate job of picking through the witch's remains, which actually didn't smell half bad to the starving tyke, for the key to the stable. She grabbed it, rushed outside, unlocked the door, and embraced her brother, who was now plumper than she'd ever seen him. They couldn't contain their relief, and they went back into the witch's house and ate to their heart's content, until their stomachs were as full as their hearts. Now, if this were my story, I'd just end it here, and have them live happily ever after in the witch's house. Their parents were awful to them, and would likely abandon them at the first sign of trouble, and that was if they even found their way home in the first place. But in the name of being true to these grim fuckers, I'll finish as they intended. Once they had eaten their fill and slept well in their beds, they decided to go back home. But first, they searched the house, in drawers and dressers and desks, and were ecstatic to find that the witch was rather rich. There was gold and silver and jewels galore. Hansel stuffed as much as he could in his pockets, and Gretel filled her pinafore, which is my new word of the day. Pinafore, a sleeveless garment worn as an apron. Neat. Then it was time to leave the gingerbread house to try to find their way home. Why they thought they wouldn't get lost this time, I have no idea, but whatever, it's almost done. They walked for a few hours before coming to a stretch of water. As there was no bridge or ferry, there was no way to cross it, and the kids were disappointed. If they'd been thinking, they'd have realized that since they hadn't crossed the water on their way into the forest with their dad, they definitely didn't have to cross it now. But again, they're kids, so whatever. Suddenly, they caught sight of a duck swimming in the shallow water, and Gretel called out to it, as kids often do.
Little duck, dost thou see? Hansel and Gretel are waiting for thee. There's never a plank or bridge in sight. Take us across on thy back so white.
Hansel turned and gave his sister a weird look, because she never talked all fancy like that, but when the duck turned and came to shore, his expression changed to one of wonder. Then, when Gretel sat on its back and it didn't sink immediately, his jaw dropped. Which makes sense, because ducks are way smaller than children. To the kids at home, do not sit on ducks. They will die. But the duck somehow remained above water, so Hansel went to take a seat as well, but Gretel stopped him.
Don't be silly, Hansel. A duck can't carry both of us. That would be ridiculous. I will go across, then the duck will come back for you.
So, that is what happened. This talking Schwarzeneggerian duck first took Gretel to the other side of the water, which they hadn't crossed before and definitely didn't need to cross, then returned and brought Hansel across the water. It was cool, and Hansel tried his best not to question it. Once they were on the other side, against all odds, they found that they recognized the area. They wandered a short time more before coming across a familiar path, which they quickly followed until they could see their house in the distance. Then they sprinted as fast as they could, though Hansel was a bit slower with his newfound girth, until they reached the door and rushed inside. Their father was delighted to see them. He lifted them both up in his arms and hugged and kissed them as they all cried. Their mother stood off to the side, sulking, until the gold and jewels started raining down from their pockets. Suddenly their mother was very pleased to see them and rushed to embrace them. Life was good from then on. Turns out, money makes it a lot easier to get along as a family. Go figure. The woodcutter no longer had to cut wood and could spend all his time playing with his children and teaching them life skills. His wife remained a bit of a bitch until one day she simply disappeared, never to be seen again. He couldn't prove it, but Hansel was pretty sure his sister had killed her. And they all lived happily ever after. Except their bitch mother who Gretel totally killed.